Welcome to Radical Feminist Perspectives. Today we'll be discussing The Transsexual Empire, The Making of the She-Male by Janice Raymond, to be discussed by me, Marian Rutigliano, and Lierre Keith. This series of webinars is run by radical feminists whose voices have been canceled or silenced in universities, schools, and media. Frustrated that we cannot share what we know in these places, we're offering this online series of webinars here. So welcome to everyone. Next slide, please. All right, Lierre,
Where are the feminists? We keep hearing this, right? Why aren't feminists doing something about this issue? So this was from the introduction to the book. This has been long in process. It began as a conference paper delivered at the New England Regional American Academy of Religion meeting in 1972. Much of it had another life as my doctoral dissertation, which was finished at Boston College in 1977. And the book was published in 79. So from the very beginning, women have been on this. That's the thing that I really wanted to point out with this slide, is that from the moment that this became an actual social issue, there were feminists who saw that this was an incredibly misogynist way to handle this sort of up and coming issue of, at the time it was called transsexuals. So it ended up being this book, and it's an amazing book. The thing to remember is that, she was out in the wilderness here. This was a brand new phenomenon in the world. It didn't exist until the medical technology existed. And then the psychiatry as an institution had to create these sort of categories to encompass these men, to try to explain them and to figure out what to do about them. And that really didn't start to happen until the 1950s and then into the 60s, because the medical technology just wasn't there. So, and then the psychiatry had to get in on it and create this concept. So, really throughout the 60s, most people had never even heard of it. But, it starts to build. You have the, Christine Jorgensen and, these sort of famous cases that hit the media. So they make a big splash because it's weird and interesting. So people do start to hear about it. But, here we are by 1972, you already have a feminist starting to analyze it. So the next time someone says, where are the feminists? I always come back to Janice Raymond and how prescient she is, how smart she was about this. There's nothing wrong in this book. I mean, she pretty much lays out the whole argument from beginning to end.
Next slide.
And it has certainly stood the test of time.
Next slide, please. This is basically what the book is about. We look at this now and we say, yeah, that's exactly what the whole trans mess is about. And I hate using that word, but and I don't call them that to their faces. I call them men. Right. But this is what the whole mess is about. And we can tick off each thing she mentions. But in 1979, when this was published, and it was actually, put together and written before that, almost no one talked about why these men wanted to live out their fantasy and what it might mean for the rest of us, especially women. Next slide, please. Lierre?
Yeah. So in just the background of the book, she explains that while she's doing this research, what she used to kind of build her arguments on, she spoke with 15 transsexuals, 13 of whom were male to constructed females. And we're going to have a slide talking about the language and why she decided to use the language that she does. But she, throughout the book in 1979, she calls them male to constructed females, used what sociologists would call, quote, the unstructured research interview. So it's a lot of open-ended questions to try to solicit in their own words what they think is going on, why they feel compelled to do this. And she got a lot of information that way. She also interviewed many of the active figures in the field of transsexual research and the therapy. So at Johns Hopkins, which was the first place to do these procedures, she talked with John Money himself, with Paul Walker, and with Eleanor Bagby. She spoke with several persons involved in these gender identity clinics, which at that point had started to spring up around the country. She talked extensively with Zelda Suplee, who is the director of the Erickson Educational Foundation. And if you don't know what that was, this woman named Reed Erickson, this woman who, of course, thought she was a man, she was one of Henry Benjamin's patients. So she was taking testosterone and doing all that. And she was quite wealthy. Reed Erickson is her name. You can look her up. But she had a lot of money. She inherited money, and then she made money in oil, essentially. So she had a lot of money, and she started an organization that was called the Harry Benjamin International Gender Dysphoria Association. And that was what eventually became WPATH. So that was where they got their original funding. And she also funded the John Hopkins when they started their gender clinic. She was one of the main funders of it. So that's where the money came from originally. And I know a lot of people, this is a brand new thing 5 years ago where they're like, where did this all come from? Well, this was back in the 70s and the 80s. How this thing got kicked off was the Erickson Educational Foundation. This one woman was the one who put a lot of money into this and, literally created this department at John Hopkins that would do these procedures. Without that money, it would never would have gotten as far as it did. So that was sort of the seed money for the whole thing came from this woman who I'm sorry, I'm sure she was just a lesbian and hated herself. So that's how we ended up with this. Anyway, she talked to the people at that foundation, and then she interviewed several doctors and counselors who were privately quote treating men who considered themselves transsexual. So that's where the research came from. That's sort of what she drew from to do this, to pull all these, she just wanted the primary sources essentially, like what is going on, who are these men, why is this happening, who thinks they can treat them, why are we using this sort of psychiatric model for this. So that was her research. Okay, next slide.
Next slide. Yeah, the Johns Hopkins, actually shortly after this was published, and I don't know that the book had anything to do with it because I think they were already realizing that there was no difference in long-term adjustment for individuals who undergo the surgery and those who do not, those who trans and those who don't. There was no difference. So Hopkins stopped doing it because they said it doesn't help. So it took us 40 years from then to the Cass report within the past couple of weeks, over 40 years and a lot of damaged minds and bodies to come to the same conclusion that Hopkins came to after 1979. Hopkins did go back to doing the surgeries, I guess about maybe 10 or 15 years ago.
Yeah, it was very
Because
depressing.
there's money to be made and
Yeah.
papers to be published and things like that. But they concluded appropriately, in what the Cass report came out with a few weeks ago, that the surgery, which was really at that time the crux of the whole transing process, it served as a palliative measure, but did not cure what is essentially a psychiatric disturbance. Next slide.
And she says, it's my own hypothesis that other not so public reasons were also influential in the demise of that program. John Money, the founder and chief publicist for the Hopkins program, member of the Gender Identity Committee, and author of numerous articles and books on transsexualism and intersexuality, had branched out into the realms of child pornography and incest. So this is the guy who's at the center of the program, who's writing all the articles about it, who's developing all the theories about why are men transsexuals. He had lectured and written that incest need not necessarily affect a child adversely, and that the law should differentiate between traumatic and non-traumatic incest. So if you don't know this about John Money, I would do a deeper dive on him because this is exactly what he did from the late 70s into the 80s. He was making these arguments and making them very publicly. And a lot of his colleagues were fairly horrified about where he was going with all of this. So I said, it's not a good look. And so she's conjecturing here that John Money's behavior, his very public, defending, incest and child sexual abuse is something that wasn't particularly harmful to kids. was not a good look publicly, and that may be another reason that this program was shut down. We don't know, but it's certainly worth considering because he was quite public about it. So, yeah, another reason that the whole thing may have tanked. But this has been there from the very beginning, that the men who were involved in this, both the men who were arguing for it and the men who were, being quote treated as transsexuals, there has always been this thread running through of um, pedophilia and this kind of fetishistic behavior that tends to spread out. This is the problem with this sort of fetishistic kind of sexual practices, is that you get one, they tend to clump. And so there is a lot of pedophilia that's wrapped up in this. And we're not supposed to say that in public. I don't know why. It's been there from the very beginning. And we used to know that, but now that's, verboten. We can't say it out loud. So, okay, next
Next
slide.
slide. Yeah, I mean, and there it is. The whole, the whole juggernaut is now really mask off.
Yeah,
Promotion of increasingly worse pornography, and where will it end? Pedophilia, incest, and increasingly sadistic sexual misogyny. But it was there. I mean, it was there,
yeah,
bubbling just under the surface at the start.
yeah.
Next slide. Um, yeah, 1991 article talking about medical collusion with an unattainable fantasy, and she makes reference in the book at that point to Stone Butch Blues by Leslie Feinberg, which she mentions again later on, and her constructed female to male efforts, hormones, double mastectomy, passing as a male on the street, and social encounters, but even said it's a very depressing, sad book, but even Leslie Feinberg said, despite all that, she said, I was still me on the inside. So a completely unattainable fantasy that at that point, people couldn't, nobody was saying out loud, at least, this really is true, and forcing the rest of us to believe it. Next slide.
I remember when that article came out. I don't know if you remember it, Marian, but it was sort of a moment for me of sort of relief of like, all right, the adults are going to step into the room. Like, this isn't going to go any further than it's gone. Oh, that things could have gone that way, but it didn't help. But I do remember just feeling some sense of relief of like, all right, a major medical journal has noticed that this is just kind of ridiculous, that they're doing terrible things to these, perfectly healthy human bodies for
I
no good
know.
reason, really.
And
So,
here's where the feminists were. I mean, she
yeah.
saw that women, she says, had a political outlet, which was
Yeah.
feminism to challenge rigid sexuals. But this was in 1994, when the
Yeah.
worst excesses of liberal feminism were still yet to come and starting to grow. I mean, I don't think it's a coincidence that as second wave feminism waned in practice and influence, more women, as younger generations grew up, turned to the whole trans thing.
Yeah. But also, at this point, still, even in 1994, it's still the majority of people who are taking on this identity and whatnot are men.
Yep.
And the flip hasn't happened quite yet demographically, where now you have this overwhelming number of women doing it instead. So at this point, she's like, well, it's still, fairly rare to find women who are doing this. It was 85% male to female, but
Yeah.
that didn't hold. So
It was
next
a new
slide.
edition,
Yeah.
1994.
And
Yeah.
this is from the introduction. So yeah. So even, this is an article from Reuters that everybody had to see finally that in fact it's mostly affecting teenage girls now, that this became a social contagion. And you have Lisa Littman, the rapid onset gender dysphoria, she does that whole thing and basically loses her career over it. But yeah, it flipped. So by 2016, 75% of them were in fact girls. It had flipped completely in that time period. So
Yeah.
it feminism stopped protecting,
4,000%
being
increase.
a protective shield against women doing this. It all collapsed and the trans thing took over. So okay,
Yeah.
next.
I mean, she goes through, you can have to hang on for this one for a while, but I mean, she just goes through a lot of theories. If you read the book, she goes through all these theories, these psychiatric theories about why men trans, they're all psychology based, including, desire for the power that women have by virtue of female biology to give birth. She goes through all these things, but she points out that men fetishize and objectify, which enables them to, objectify their own bodies. And as you so accurately noted, the number of girls and young women, it increased by 4,000% over like a 5-year period. and which was, for incipient young lesbians, this was conversion therapy and severe lesbophobia. The gender ideologues, will say that exploring depression, anxiety, ADHD, sexuality, when a kid suddenly decides that they are the opposite sex, they say that's conversion therapy. But if a kid decides, like 50% of her peers, that she's a boy, she's already been subjected to conversion practices. Next slide. Oh,
Right. So what's coming? I mean, some of us here have lived through this time. So Judith Butler, here we are, 1989. Um, this was I don't know. I felt like this was kind of a very bad moment, when this book hits, because all across academia, this gets taken up as the most wonderful thing we've all supposed to have read, and it's basically unintelligible. But what you can pull out of it is fairly horrifying, because she says women essentially don't exist, that it's all a performance, and that women cannot be the center of feminism. That all you're doing is upholding the binary, and the binary is the problem. So it's all this, she takes postmodernism and then sort of applies it to women, and that women, yeah, so women don't exist, and any attempt to say that women exist is only making it worse, because that's, the mean, terrible binary is the problem, not male power. So women cannot be the center of feminism. And she says this point blank. So she made it absolutely impossible for an entire generation of women to become feminists. The moment that you were given this in college, unless you could figure it out on your own, or stumbled into Andrew Dworkin, it was over. And I saw this, in living color, how there was this whole, I was like the last one, who actually got radical feminism. Anybody younger than me at that point in time, you assumed that they were queer, and that this was kind of going to be the politics that they would espouse, would be this sort of postmodern, just garbage, essentially. And you couldn't reach them once Judith Butler had got to them. It was near impossible to find a way back. And I remember talking to women who had jobs in academia and were trying to teach feminism still at that point, and they all would say the same thing: if I can get to them first with a little bit of Dworkin, they're inoculated against this. But if the Butler people get them first, you can't get through to them. It's like a cult. Like, there's just no way through, and it's a maze in their minds, and there's no way to break them out of it. So this was 1989. I started to see this around me, and it was absolutely the women who were younger than me that were, like, at risk, essentially. I was, like I said, I was sort of the last one who sort of got into the second wave. I'm going to be 60 this year, and anybody younger than me, they just didn't seem to have access to actual radical feminism, and this was what they got instead. So it starts to bubble along in academia, and at this point, of course, it's spread out into completely into social media and popular culture. But this was a real moment, and a very bad moment, when this starts to happen, and they're taking
yeah.
over at least academia, and women who had access to kind of theory, that this is what they're going to come back with, and not anything that was actual feminism. And in fact, anti-feminism is what they were given. So, okay,
I
next
was in,
slide.
well, I was in New York City, in 1989 when the book came out, and Judith Butler gave this lecture, like, to introduce her book. So I went with a friend, and we're sitting there thinking, and people were attentive and impressed, because the book opened up with what was considered a brilliant observation, and probably the only true thing in the book, is that gender, or what we had been calling sex role stereotypes, was socially constructed, which radical feminists already knew.
Right.
And that's where Brilliant got that brilliant observation from. But that was the only brilliant thing in the book and in her lecture. And you don't have to read the rest of the book, because it doesn't say anything else substantively comprehensible, except that, women don't exist. But it was a springboard, it was springboard for the justifications and explanations of why men in particular are able to say that they are or ought to be women. And this was when the first inklings of I really am a woman came around, and you'd start to hear it, which I hadn't heard before. These guys were around, but there was no, there was no illusion. They were deluded, but the rest of us at least weren't being forced to collude in the delusion that they were actually women.
Right.
Next slide. So,
And then this hit, and this was
oh,
this was the end. So this was Stone Butch Blues, and so it's a thinly disguised memoir. I mean, it's a lot of this is just her life story. She's dead now. She died from liver disease from the testosterone. So this book came out, and it was just devastating. So from this point forward, you have this sort of massive number of young women, particularly lesbians, who take up these practices. She definitely kind of laid the path for them to walk. And I was living in Northampton, Massachusetts, which is like, Mecca for kind of lesbian community, whatever. And it was horrible to watch. Just a few years after this, I remember going to a party that was entirely all women party. I would say mostly lesbian. I would say 90%. And there was a woman there, a young woman, who just announced to I'm going to have my breast removed. And everybody there were two of us who were appalled, and everybody else in that room thought it was so wonderful and radical, and they cheered her on. On a dime, the whole thing had flipped. And I remember going home, A, and crying, but also B, just feeling like this is going to get really bad, isn't it? Like, nobody in that room was horrified that this woman was going to take up such something that was so misogynist, just so profoundly body hating as having her breasts removed. They all just said, "Oh, this is radical. This is wonderful. This is the thing we should all be doing." There was no resistance to it at all. So it is amazing how just a few books can really turn the tide. Given that it's an area that has there's 5 colleges in the area, so they all had been through these, sort of the academic world first, and I'm sure had read Judith Butler and were given this book in class as well. And it had just created this whole subculture where this was what you did now. Whereas 10 years previous, they would have at least found some radical feminism. There was nothing in the way to give them any inoculation against this stuff. So everybody just took it up. And
And
I still didn't realize how bad it was going to get. I still thought, all right, this is it's still a small kind of subculture, and it's going to be profoundly destructive to a handful of women. But the extent to which this has taken over the culture, I don't think any of us saw how bad this was going to be. So anyway,
I mean, you were still, and you talked about, this gathering, and it was all women,
yeah,
which could never happen anymore. I mean,
nope, there would
in
certainly
the
be men there now.
Northampton, the very
Yeah,
bosom of lesbiana, as it were,
yeah.
um, you know, gatherings of all women, and even Northampton now is captured by gender ideology.
Oh,
This was a
completely. Yeah,
profoundly sad book, Stone Butch
yeah.
Blues. It really was. Next slide. Um, Raymond discusses the various types of surgeries being done at the time, but now there are more types of surgeries. There are surgical improvements, in the surgeries being done now. And the overwhelming majority of men now who say they're women keep their male genitalia fully intact and functional to the point of using Viagra and related drugs if they need to. Um, but having a surgical essentially what they call a front hole created because it's in the wrong place for where the male genitalia is. It's not where a vagina is. Having that created is usually pursued by men who want to live as supposed straight women and have relationships with heterosexual men. But the vast majority of men who trans now are heterosexual autogynephilic men, and they nearly all keep their penis and testicles. And yeah, she also makes reference throughout the book to the involvement of and the profits made by surgeons and pharmaceutical companies as driving forces in the expansion of transsexualism. Um, Remember, I mean, she said this, in 1979, when the involvement of, and these profits were just a fraction of the unimaginable, to most people, pharmaceutical, surgical, gender complex, the military industrial complex. Well, there's a pharmaceutical trans complex, and we see that now. She saw this in what reads like prophecy back then.
Yeah, and at this point here that she makes about the very last sentence, men acquiring the female body not only as sexual or reproductive property, but through hormonal and surgical construction. So that women's bodies have to be available to men, and if that means they want to try to like buy female body parts for themselves, the surgeons are more than willing to try to construct those. So again, it's just this profound objectification that, a woman is just breasts that can be attached and this sort of fake genitalia that can be like we're Lego blocks that you can just snap parts on and off. And this is one of the things that has always really just profoundly, deeply bothered me about this movement is this
Yeah.
real hatred of the human animal, that they really think that we are just, some kind of inanimate objects. They always talk about, your meat suit or your flesh suit, as if we are not here if we don't have, like, we are our bodies. And that was our bodies ourselves, right? Wasn't that thing? Like, you can't be here if you don't have a body. That's what it is to be alive. And then, all these sort of dehumanizing kind of ideas that, I mean, this goes all the way back to the Greeks, right? Where you've got this mind body split, this terrible dualism across Western culture. And this is just the newest version of this, where you're not your body, you're a mind that's somewhere out here. And then this body is just this thing you sort of have to drag around. Well, why not chop it up into parts? It doesn't matter. It doesn't have any integrity of its own. There's no like physical wholeness that we're supposed to be experiencing. And then along comes sexual objectification. So this is the sort of the final, the landing place of all of this is, yeah, you can just buy breasts and stick them on. You can just try to buy a vagina and have that inserted. And why not? Women are just a collection of body parts, and men can just own them for themselves. So I just thought this was a really profound insight that's there throughout the book, that she gets that this is just, sort of the end point of the pornographic worldview, that men can just buy women. They can buy one of
Yeah,
their own now and just try to become that object.
there's no understanding of the I mean, if your father um you know uh, carries a Y-bearing sperm and it fertilizes your mother's ovum, which is always X-bearing, um you are male at that point of fertilization. And if you are 30 years old and saying just because I have a penis doesn't make me a male, no, you were already a male at that instant. And everything that happens, they say, oh, it's just about chromosomes. The cascade of incredible events that happens after that moment of fertilization, it's like, one little point in time, just blossoming out one, thing after another, into an ever complex cascade. If you're a male, it's the male cascade. If you're a female, it's the female cascade. That is pretty profound. And that is, you can stick blocks on it all you want, but at that point, that one split second in time, you became male permanently for the rest of your life. And I think that's pretty profound. Next slide. And she also analyzes, the underpinnings of transsexual, um, looking at the men who were the transsexuals at the time. Um, at the time, they were primarily, or at least ostensibly, gay men. And I say ostensibly because they had to live as women for at least 2 years. There were some places that made them do it for 5 years. And they made sure that these guys were not attracted to women sexually, because even then, the sexologists, the psychiatrists, they saw the men who we now know as, autogynephilic, heterosexual trans as unfit fetishists who shouldn't be trans. The men who were approved as transsexuals had to successfully be able to adopt and thereafter always mimic feminine stereotypes, besides being passing, because that meant that they really had an underlying female identity. Um, it was, it was, there were occasional very wealthy men who kind of got through and played the game, who were the autogynephilic heterosexual men. But for the most part, this was like a real belief that, these guys, these gay men, really should have been born straight. Any thoughts on that, Lierre?
I think there were a lot of them that got through anyway, or
Yeah,
they would get it on the black market, or they would go to Thailand.
yep,
Because you certainly saw them around.
yeah,
There would always be one that would turn up, um, and, try to wreck a women's only event. But I just remember in the early 80s that I would see these older women just approach them, and they would surround them and they'd say, "You don't belong here," and they would escort them out of the building. And I mean, I was really just a teenager at that point, but being very impressed that women would be that, that they would just confront them and be that brave about it, and just, this is not for you. You're not going to let you just sit here and perv on us all evening. And they would just escort him out. And then sometimes they would turn up at like lesbian bars and stuff, but um, they would just sit there at the counter and just sort of see that everybody that they saw, and we would just ignore them. So I mean, they were always there. That sort of,
Yeah.
uh,
I'm older, so I saw them there. I came out in 1969. So even in the early 70s, I saw these guys around. And there were not a lot of them. There were not a lot of them, but they were there. They would furtively kind of look at each other. And if they were like, and keep in mind, this is New York City, this is Manhattan in the village. So, it was like, gay Mecca. Um, there would be occasional, like just, mixed gay male and lesbian events, fundraisers, things like that. And these guys would show up. And the gay male drag queens, knew that there was something off about these guys, that they were not one of them. And they tried to, avoid them, which was fine with the AGP heterosexual males because they did not want to be identified as gay male drag queens. So they would, be very, very abusive towards butch lesbians. They would try to glom on to the femme lesbians. And they would try to, try to get into lesbian bars and lesbians events. And if they got in at all in a bar, that what you described, they would sit there and probably basically gather mental masturbation material, visually. But they could even get kicked out. And for the most part, they weren't even let in. And you could do that back then. And they had no recourse.
right.
But I remember, one, lesbian bartender and a couple of very perceptive gay male drag queens who said, you got to watch out for these guys. There's something wrong about these guys. There's going to get to be more of them, and they're going to kill lesbian community. And we kind of said that's pretty, pessimistic thinking, but they were right. Next
Turned
slide,
out to be
please.
true.
Yeah, and I mean, it was, so it was a medical problem to be solved in response to psychological issues. Uh,
And even from the beginning, she noted that they were going after the children, that they were going to need children to be the human shields to make this all acceptable. Um, yeah, and ultimately, transsexual surgery reinforces sexual conformity by encouraging the individual to become an agreeable participant in role-defined society, substituting one sexual stereotype for the other. And I feel like, ever since she kind of laid this down, it's been anyone who's got a feminist analysis can see this, that all they're doing is reinforcing that, oh, this is the true nature of women, this is the true nature of men, and I don't fit the man box. So, oh, I must belong over here in the woman box because I like pink and I like frilly things and I want to be subordinated and I want the man to take charge of everything and oh, I'm just a bimbo and all this crap. But that is apparent from the very beginning, and she goes into a lot of the literature was we'll see that just honestly just supports the most ridiculous ideas about what a woman is. But it's right there from the very beginning that this is just you're reinforcing the worst stereotypes about what it means to be a man or a woman. But that the children are going to be necessary for this. She was onto this in 1979.
One of the things that's so insidious about this is that in much of, even in gender trouble, there was a germ of something that was real. Sex role stereotypes are socially constructed, gender is socially constructed. So it's like, well, that's fine. I mean, she could have written that in a pamphlet. But it made it seem like, oh, she knows what she's talking about, so all this other stuff may be true. The same thing here. It's and she talks about it in the book, that John Money in particular. Well, is it biology? Is it socially constructed? And he waffled back and forth, and he really believed that it was all biology, that we were just completely destined, for our behavior because of biology, that these socially constructed, roles were somehow genuinely connected. He talks about gender identity, being set in stone by age 18 months. Well, it, gender identity isn't set in stone, but sex role stereotypes are kind of, really, set um, or very, very strong by 18 months, because there's been research since then, about the behavior of boys by the time they're 18 months, that they behave very, very differently than girls. And it has nothing to do with biology, because, um, a lot of the research had to do with how parents actually treat their babies, when they're newborn, if they're girls versus if they're boys. The toys that they get, the games that they play, things like that. That's that is socially imposed. That's not biology. But people hang on to like one little thing that already supports perhaps a worldview that, oh, little girls are sugar and spice and everything nice, and little boys are puppy dog tails, and that's not biology. That's socially constructed. Um, Next slide. She went through all these theories, being that had been postulated for why these men felt that they were or they should be women. But feminism provided the answer. And I just want to read one thing that I think is really um, um, well put. In examining the various theories of psychological causation, one factor becomes very evident. All of them measure the degree of conformity to culturally defined norms of masculinity and femininity. In most of those theories, male transsexuals who were feminized and failed to become masculine were assessed by prevailing norms of masculinity and femininity. The psychological literature obviously regards this as not only deviant behavior, but as undesirable for so-called healthy male development. A negative judgment is attached to so-called feminine qualities expressed by boys and men. The stereotypes, the cultural norms of masculine and femininity themselves are never criticized. If the stereotypes themselves are not confronted, but are only frowned upon when acted out by persons of the wrong sex, then the origins of transsexualism will be individualized and psychologized. What will go unexamined is patriarchy's norms of masculinity and femininity, and how those norms, if allowed to contain persons within such rigid boundaries, may generate such a phenomenon as transsexualism. I think that that's I really, really succinct, and really one of the key passages in the book.
Yeah, and this idea that there's this, ontological reality to what are essentially, it's a political set of, behavioral directives. But, when you jump into this ideology instead, then all of this it's like it exists in the universe. There's just this thing that's masculinity, and then over here there's this thing that's femininity. And if those are real and they just sort of are floating around as sort of cosmic principles, then certainly it might be possible that you could be this rather than that. But that is that's a political stand. That's not, we don't have to agree that these things are real, in that ontological sense. And this is where the we're not allowed to question at that level. They all just accept that this is true. But this is just, it's just becomes a religious kind of ideal, that it's a religious, like that you could just have a soul that now is in the wrong body. You've got the pink soul in the blue body, or vice versa. And I don't know why we have to agree to this. Like, this is not a religion that I ever agreed that it could be a thing. I just reject this wholeheartedly, and I always have. And it's bizarre to me that people who are, consider themselves progressive, that some of them are atheists, who are even barely religious in any way, are willing to just accept this as the nature of the cosmos now. Like it's like we're right back into the Middle Ages or something. And it just seems utterly bizarre that how this ideology has taken over people who are otherwise thoughtful and whatever educated. It just seems really, which just shows the power of patriarchy, right?
Well,
They were
and it's
all
a
willing
cult.
to just take it back right on. Like we had this brief moment where we were allowed to question this, and now the most liberal of the liberal have decided, oh no, there's a real thing out there in the universe that's femininity, and men might be born that way.
It's such a cult. Next slide.
So she has a
Lierre.
long discussion in the book, very thoughtful about what we call these men, because you do need a word for them sometimes. So it used to be transvestism, and it used to be fetishistic transvestism, or transvestic fetishism was a word that was used by some of the original sexologists. They got that this was that these men were sexually, there was a sexual driver behind this. And I think one of the reasons that was in the original literature was because, going all the way back, but, Magnus Hirschfeld himself was in fact an autogonophile. So I think he struggled with this his whole life. And that was, one of the reasons that he was so sympathetic to them and wanted to investigate it, was because he he had those proclivities, and I don't think he knew what to do about it. So that was back in 1910. Um, so then you come up through the 20th century, and it not much changes, and then they discovered actual hormones, and then these surgeries start to be, they start experimenting on people essentially, some of whom die very famously. So now what are you going to call them? So transsexual, they start using that word. And then they need to take the sex out of it. So they come up with transgender. Jan Raymond herself settled on, in this book anyway, settled on male to constructed female because she realized, like, one by one, we all come to realize you can't say male to female. That's a lie, and we don't want to participate in the lie. Now, I still see a lot of women saying things like MTF or M to T, which came a little bit later. But she realized early on that you can't grant this, that it's a lie. They do not become female. So she inserted the word constructed. So male too, and then there's this idea of a constructed female that's not really female, but is, has these bizarre surgical procedures and takes the hormones. And so you're changing some of the characteristics, these sort of surface characteristics of the body. So she called it that. I wouldn't even want to grant them that at this point. So we still see MTF a lot, but then I remember kind of in the early, like, 2010s, somewhere in there, the 20 teens, other radical feminists saying, look, they don't become female. We all know this. So let's call them male to trans. So MT to T took over for a while, but that wasn't enough. I never felt like that really got to the problem either, because you're still saying that trans is some kind of category that, has validity, and it doesn't. You're still male. You're not going anywhere else with this. There's nothing
Yeah.
else you can transform yourself into. So I didn't really stick with that one very long either. Eventually we got to Tim, because there's this long phrase like men who are pretending to be women, or men who are transitioning to something that's not anything but male. Like, what are you going to call? Sometimes you just need a word for these guys. So I understand there's still this bubbling along in there. Like, well, what are we going to call them? So Tim, I think a lot of us just use that as kind of shorthand because it's a man's name, and I think that drives them insane. And then of course Tiff for the women who are attempting this. Um, so I think Tim is sort of something that it's not doesn't necessarily work because you're still using that word trans. So there's still some way that it legitimates this as a concept. So I get why some women reject it. But it's hard because otherwise you're stuck with a sentence. You have to say men who are, have special woman feels, or,
I
men who
know.
are lying about being a woman, which I'm happy to say in public. And I have said it in big interviews. I will never say that there's such a thing as trans. So I'm not, I
That's
don't
why
use
it's
their
always
language, but
trans.
trans. Yeah, I always just do the little air quotes. Okay,
Trans. I mean,
trans.
it's a short, but
These
it's
men
trans.
who are
And
pretending
I
to
won't
be
say
women.
transition. I will not
Yeah,
say
no, there's
transition.
no such thing as transition. I absolutely, and I will call people on it every time. Okay, you know that this is not possible, right? There is no way to transition from male to female, and this is one of the things that drives me crazy, even about things like the Cass report. She doesn't address this. Transition is not a thing. It's a lie. There are some surgical procedures you can have that will change it's cosmetic surgery. It does not change the basic reality of your body. It's not possible to do that. You can wreck your body taking wrong sex hormones. You can do terrible things to yourself, but you have not even made yourself a tiny bit more male by doing this to the female body. It's not possible. And then you get the next level of well, then what do you call the detransitioners? Because that always just kind of sticks in my craw a little bit. And I don't have a particularly big platform for this. These are not procedures I ever tried on myself. So, but I do hope women who have been through this, who are survivors of this movement, I still encourage them to find a better word, because transition and detransition are not real. Um, you are a survivor of horrendous medical abuse. You are a survivor of a cult-like mentality, of a very misogynist cult that you've managed to get yourself out of, and all power to you for crawling out of that. But you didn't transition, and so detransition doesn't make any sense to me either. But I don't have a better suggestion except things like survivor, medical survivor, gender survivor. Might be language that might be more useful, but I don't know. Nobody seems to want to take this up. So we're sort of stuck using their words for now. But I think that is more, I think there's better language out there that is still could still evolve from this, that I wish that the women who have become feminist would perhaps consider. Because the moment you say detransition, you're saying that transition was real, and it wasn't. You did not become a man at any point during these destructive practices. So I don't know, Marian, what do you think?
I like MPW, men pretending to be women. It hasn't caught on. That was actually my invention about 4 years
No, I know
ago.
it was. I love it. Yeah.
And I tried to circulate it, and it got a little bit of use, but it never really caught on. I guess it doesn't trip off the tongue as easily. Someone in the comments asked, what was the working relationship, or the between Mary Daly and Janice Raymond. You may know more about that. I know one was the teacher and one was the student.
Yeah, Mary Daly was her PhD thesis advisor. They had a very close relationship, so they were um, yeah, they had lifelong friends and all that. So that was um, obviously. I mean, it's we all we you know you don't do this without a community. You need a community of like-minded others to do this kind of scholarship and this kind of theory. Radical feminism never happens to just one woman. There's always a group that are, you have to have those night-long discussions, and the way that the energy and the ideas kind of bubble along, and you all you feed each other. It becomes a stronger and stronger network of of ideas, and so they had that community there for a while when Jan was writing that, her book, and there were a lot of other women that were involved, both in the Boston and then further to the west in the Northampton area. There were a lot. I mean, Adrienne Rich lived there for a while. Michelle Cliff. You can do this little tour, like if like, okay, that's where Mary Daly lived, and that's where Adrienne Rich lived. Like we know all these places with the little
Yeah,
houses that they rented,
yeah.
so you can do that tour, if you're in the know. So yeah, there's a whole community that was radical feminism that helped create those books that we all then got to read, and transformed our world. So yeah.
Next slide, please. And there's a this is like a really a big part of why medicine and big pharma is so enmeshed with the whole trans juggernaut. And you've mentioned it before. They made womanhood into a series of line items, that can be purchased,
Right.
to make the fantasy into a simulation of reality. Next slide, please. The only thing missing is what we have now, which is the forced cooperation of the rest of us. That, if you you know, if one of these guys, back in 1970 had said, "I'm really a woman and I want you to call me she," everybody would have just laughed or said, she said this. It was just nonsensical. And it still is. Next slide, please.
This
And
is from her interviews. And even at the time, she noted how strongly these men believed in the most um, just really like profound level of sexual stereotypes that, at that point, nobody else in the culture was really clinging to, unless you were extremely right wing. Like it was 1979. It was the 70s were a happening thing. We had free to be you and me, and like I think most people got that human flourishing was not happening under patriarchy, that we needed something a little bit bigger for, just to be human. That the 50s were ridiculous and they were over. And the people who had been socialized in that era had tried to throw it off. It was like, we don't want to live like this. Um, and yet here's these men who are, really just bearing down on it. So here's Elizabeth saying, I feel everything should be distinctly masculine or feminine. My boyfriend has to look like a real man. And then the next one, the ultimate criterion of being a woman is to be a good wife, being able to make a man happy. I feel that a man should make more money than a woman. And so she's discovering, this is original research. She's discovering that these men are really clinging to these the worst stereotypes out there, and they really are about sexual subordination. That they clearly have a fetish for, being the subordinated, taking the subordinate role in, uh, these practices that are. This is just it's driven by a sexual urge to be subordinated. Is really where this comes from. And there's like this brief moment where you can say that out loud, and now it's just gone. Like nobody's allowed to say that anymore, and it's still the driving force behind this movement. They're allowed to say it. I mean, I just need to point out, Andrea Long Chu won a Pulitzer Prize for writing an entire book about how, being a woman is about men having universal access to, a whole that is the universal female. And he's allowed to say this quite openly and proudly, that this is what he wants because that's what women are, and he enjoys trying to be subordinated. But we can't say it as radical feminists, even when the men are perfectly open about it. So anyway, she trips into this in the book. She realized in her interviews that that's what was going on.
There are certainly women who embrace it, who absolutely embrace it, who say that, I am nurturing because that's my biology, that or I am put in any feminine quality you want and say, oh, it's because of my biology. Women are born this way. No, I mean, there's no credible evidence for that. Next slide, please. And the end result of all this is what we see now. The invasiveness. She's talking about they cut off the most obvious means of invading women, the penis, which hardly any of them do anymore. But that their whole presence becomes a member invading women's presence and dividing us once more from each other. Next slide, please. And this invasiveness, which is really more like an infestation, has obviously gotten worse by so many orders of magnitude, with no space at all for women that excludes men, no space for lesbians that excludes men masquerading as women. Next slide, please. And she was very prophetic about these heterosexual autogynephilic men. I talked about this before, how they were there. I mean, they were there at the start. They had a harder time finding each other. There was no internet at the time. Shame kind of kept them in the closet and kept it private because they could get fired from their jobs. They were ridiculed. And it's okay to ridicule that which is ridiculous. It really is. But she was just prophetic. She gives the illustration of Olivia Records even being founded with a
Sandy Stone.
a man pretending to be a lesbian who was an engineer, and some lesbians go along with this and say, "Oh,
I
you're
met
welcome
him
here."
once. I got to meet Sandy Stone once.
Really? Did he
Oh yeah.
pass?
No, of course not. It was
Um,
ridiculous. And he had this long hair, and at that point he was like in his 50s, and he's just like this constant like petting of the hair, like this. It's just repulsive, that hyper feminine thing that with the gestures that they do. Oh, it's just this
I know.
ridiculous human being.
And
And it
even
just
though,
feels pathetic. Like I just felt sorry for him too. Like as destructive as he had been, it's still
well,
you just sort of feel like, oh, it's just this God, it's ridiculous.
yeah,
He's walking
and the
around in
thing
public
is
like
that
this.
even the lesbians who go along and say, "Oh, she's really a woman and stuff,"
A woman
still
inside.
refuse to willingly date or have sex with these men.
Yeah.
If you can stomach it, go to those sites where they talk among themselves and they complain all the time how,
No one
how,
will date
oh,
them.
all the lesbians, they really support me. They know I'm a woman, but they won't date and
No
have
one will
sex with
date
me.
them. Well, hence the cotton ceiling. Why that whole that
Yeah.
horrible workshop happened is because no one will date them.
Yeah. Next slide, please. Okay. And yeah, you wanna
Yeah. So she's critiquing here the whole medical model. And remember, she is an ethicist. She's a medical ethicist. So this is, I think where this sort of picks up steam for her is examining the ethics of this whole thing. So the problem with the medical model is that it de-ethicizes the problems and the behavior. So this question of, is something ethical? Is it good? Is it right? Drops from the picture entirely. So you're not allowed to look at the moral implications. It all gets reclassified as something that's therapeutic. It's a health issue. It's psychiatric management. So the triumph of the therapeutic has made transsexualism the territorial imperative of psychologists, psychiatrists, or mental health workers. So it's redefined away from the area of, is this good for humans? Why would we do this to humans? Do we need to do this to humans? What does it mean that we do this to humans? None of those questions, the sort of basic of a sort of ethical approach, not even a political approach, but just an ethical approach. Like, is it good for human flourishing? Drops from the picture entirely. It just gets completely defined as it's a medical issue. It's for medicine to decide whether this can be done. And then, of course, we will do it if we can do it. And so it's a technical problem that can just be resolved by the medical profession. And that's where we are now is, yeah, it just completely bypasses all of those questions. And of course, as feminists, we want to insert the political issues as well. Like, what does this mean for women that these things might even be considered? You know, like the sort of the ground behind this is just massive misogyny. So are we going to stand on that ground or not? And so she's trying to bring, there's a whole chapter where she's trying to bring this back in. You know, are we allowed to question psychiatry? Because this is a massive industry and it's not value neutral. You know, they put themselves forward as, you know, quote, scientific and therefore value neutral, but that's a lie because clearly this is, you know, this is doing terrible harm to humans when we insert that's true. Then you can't question what harm it's doing to humans. So that's why this is a very good chapter. It's really just getting, I think, to the root of what has gone so wrong with this whole model. So
Making it personal is that means you get to say, oh, this is such a this poor woman. Be kind, be kind.
yeah,
Instead of, you know, it's all political. I mean, and radical feminism saw this where it's all patriarchy. The entire and she says that. My God, she was brilliant throughout the book. She says that. Next slide, please. Um, Masochism.
she was totally onto it.
Yeah. I mean, you know, again, if you can stomach what these guys say to each other, where they talk to each other, there's so much, um, there's so barely hidden contempt, just misogyny for women. But that's the class that they want to join. So so it's almost like they feel they're being, you know, demoted in terms of humanity to womanhood. But that gives them such sexual arousal. Somebody talked about, you know, if these straight guys, you know, if they're married, they're with women, did they then go to men? No, for the most part, they don't. I mean, the heterosexual men, you know, the autogynephilic, and they're all autogynephilic, but the heterosexual men, the autogynephiles who trans, remain heterosexual men even when they're having sex with each other. They realize no lesbian wants them. There's very few other women who will want them. So when they get desperate for sex and really deeply in the delusion or fantasy that they're women, they have lesbian relationships. Some of them find that there's a validation that comes with having a men find them sexually active or want to, you know, penetrate them. So they say, oh, now I like men as well. That's called pseudo bisexuality.
Right.
They're still really heterosexual men. They are. And if they, you know, and if they could find women who were properly submissive, who would validate them, that's what they'd be doing. But they find, oh, if a man is like, you know, the effing me, I must really be a woman. That's pseudo bisexuality. They're not really bisexual because they're not particularly attracted to men, but they're attracted to the fact that a man will have sex with them, penetrate them, go out with them, and that means they're a woman. But most of them, for the most part, remain absolutely attracted to women, have sex and relationships with each other as two women, and call themselves lesbians, which is like pretty disgusting. Next slide, please. And this is the final slide. This is really like the book telescoped into a very brilliant summation of what has happened and why. Many feminists are opposed to transsexualism, yet that opposition, having moved outside the limits of tolerance set up by the medical authorities, will often be decried as intolerant. What is happening here is a fundamental reversal. And
Yeah.
that's a huge connection to Mary Daly, who talked about patriarchal reversal. And that's what this is. Tolerance toward that which is radically evil now appears as good. Be kind, because it serves the cohesion of the whole on the road to affluence or more affluence. And Jennifer Billick followed the money, and can tell you an awful lot about the affluence of the of the pharmaceutical companies, and what a driving force they've been behind all this. So it's not only tolerance in the service of medical affluence that we witness in the transsexual situation, but tolerance in the service of medical control, specifically the control of women. So it is, as it always was, and is underneath its patriarchy. Any last words, Lierre?
Yeah, there's a lot of comments in the little chat box about, oh, be kind, and this gets to that as well. But be kind is just left-wing women. You know, Andrew Dworkin wrote very famously about right-wing women and what is demanded of women in order to get protection and status as a good woman, and the way that it's called benign patriarchy, that if you follow the rules of patriarchy and take care of men and children, you are a woman worthy of respect and you will get some protection from men. That is the bargain that some women are willing to take. And hopefully you don't get a batterer, because if you do, you're fucked. But if you don't, that this is what the right wing will promise you, is you get respect and protection and all of this. And on the left, it's the same thing. This is the problem, and women are just doing the same thing on the left, and it's be kind, take care of the men. And these are the super special wounded men. So you are a super special woman if you want to love him and heal him and take care of him. And it's the exact same psychology. And if you take care of these men, you're taking care of all men. And that makes you a good woman on the left. It is no different than the right-wing bargain.
This is the original. This is the first edition of the book when it first came out. I was a little baby rat fan back then, and this is the updated version in 1994, I think it was.
You got them
Thank you
both, man. You're good.
very much for being here. Thank you to everybody. Such a privilege to be able to do this.
It's a great book.
It really is.